The town of Prospect, nestled in a high valley of the unforgiving Absaroka Range, had always existed on a precarious edge. Founded on the fleeting promise of silver, it now clung to life through timber and trapping, its 100 or so souls bound by a shared, stubborn defiance of the elements. In the autumn of 1876, that defiance was beginning to feel like a fool's wager. An early squall in late September had descended with the fury of a winter gale, peeling shingles from roofs like birch bark and sending a chill of premonition through the settlement. It was a warning, and every man in Prospect knew it. Elias Thorne knew it more keenly than most. At 24, he was already a widower, having lost his wife Anna to a fever that spring, a tragedy that had cemented his status as an outsider. He had arrived 2 years prior, a quiet man with hands calloused from stone and wood, carrying little more than his grandfather's tools and a deep-seated knowledge of building practices that the men of Prospect found archaic. His cabin, which he had built himself at the northernmost edge of town, was small but solid, yet its conventional shingle roof had suffered like all the others. Patches were torn away, leaving the pine boards beneath exposed to the sky. On October 3, 1876, the men of the town gathered in the meeting hall, a drafty structure that smelled of damp wool and pine smoke. Mayor Thaddeus Thompson, a man whose authority was derived more from the size of his lumber mill than any political acumen, stood before them. He was a large man, florid and confident, a proponent of what he called modern methods. Beside him stood Silas Miller, the blacksmith, whose forearms were as thick as fence posts, and Jedediah Carlson, who owned the land on which most of the town sat. They were the arbiters of progress in Prospect, the voices of established dogma. "The storm was a trial, no doubt," Mayor Thompson began, his voice booming in the hall, "but it has shown us the weakness in our construction. We need better nails, more pitch, and shingles of a finer cut. My mill will run day and night to produce what is needed. We will rebuild, stronger than before, with good American timber and iron." A murmur of agreement went through the assembled men. It was a simple, reassuring plan. Buy the materials, do the work, and trust in the proven methods. It was then that Elias Thorne spoke, his voice quiet yet carrying a strange resonance that cut through the low chatter. "A shingle roof will always be a vulnerability in these winds," he stated, not as an opinion, but as a fact. All eyes turned to him. He was lean and weathered, with a stillness about him that unnerved the boisterous men of the town. "The wind finds the edge of a shingle and lifts. The weight of the snow sits upon it like a lever. It is a design that fights the mountain, and the mountain will always win." Silas Miller, the blacksmith, let out a short, derisive laugh. "And what do you propose, Thorne? That we build our houses of solid rock like a badger's den?" "Something like it," Elias replied, his gaze unwavering. "My grandfather in the old country built homes that have stood for centuries against winds worse than we have here. He did not fight the mountain. He made the mountain part of the home. I intend to rebuild my roof not with shingles, but with earth and stone." A wave of disbelief and quiet mockery rippled through the hall. Mayor Thompson stroked his thick mustache, a patronizing smile on his face. "Earth and stone? You mean a sod roof? Thorne, this is 1876. We are not primitive folk living in mud huts. We have sawmills, blacksmiths, modern techniques." "Your modern techniques left half the town exposed to the sky," Elias countered calmly. "I will lay a membrane of birch bark, sealed with pine pitch. Over that, a foot of dense sod, cut from the high meadow, and over that, a final layer of flat, heavy stones from the riverbed. The weight will anchor the structure against the wind. The mass will hold the warmth of the hearth. It will not be a temporary patch. It will be a permanent shield." Jedediah Carlson, the landowner, who valued appearances and property values above all else, scoffed openly. "A roof of dirt and weeds? It will be an eyesore. It will leak, it will rot your timbers, and it will collapse on your head before the first true snow. It is the single most foolish idea I have ever heard." His declaration was met with nods and grunts of assent. The matter was settled. The town would follow Mayor Thompson's lead, using milled lumber and forged nails. Elias Thorne was on his own, his unconventional wisdom dismissed as the ignorant rambling of an outcast. He said nothing more, simply turned and walked out of the hall, the sound of their condescending laughter following him into the crisp autumn air. His journey of vindication had begun not with a bang, but with the quiet closing of a door. The very next morning, on October 4th, Elias began his work. The town watched with a mixture of pity and contempt as he stripped the remaining shingles from his roof, leaving the plank sheathing bare. His first task was not to build up, but to strengthen down. The weight he planned to add would be immense, far more than the simple frame of his 16-foot by 20-foot cabin was designed to bear. His grandfather's journals, filled with precise diagrams and calculations, had been clear on this point. The foundation of a heavy roof was not on the rafters, but in the ground. He spent 4 days reinforcing the cabin's structure. From a stand of dead lodgepole pine on the slope behind his property, he harvested and hewed 4 massive posts, each a foot in diameter. These he set deep inside the cabin, one near each corner, digging 2 feet into the hard-packed earth floor and anchoring them with carefully placed fieldstones and packed clay. These posts would become the primary load-bearing elements, transferring the immense weight of the future roof directly into the earth. He then ran thick crossbeams between them, creating a rugged interior skeleton that was wholly independent of the existing walls. The cost of the heavy iron bolts and plates he used to join the beams, which he had to purchase from a grudging Silas Miller, came to $4.50. Miller charged him a premium, a small tax for his folly. With the internal frame complete, Elias turned his attention to the roof itself. He added 6 new rafters, each 6 inches thick, between the existing ones, effectively doubling the strength of the roof deck. He paid a boy 10 cents to help him haul the lumber, and even that small interaction was fraught with the town's judgment. "My pa says you're building your own tomb," the boy said, wide-eyed, before running off with the coin. Elias ignored the comment and focused on the grain of the wood, on the precise cut of his saw, on the solid, satisfying thud of the hammer driving the nails home. This phase of the project required an additional $2 in nails, bringing his total expenditure to $6.50. The next step was the most crucial for water tightness, the membrane. On October 9th, Elias ventured into a dense grove of paper birch trees deep in the valley, a place the loggers ignored because the wood was poor for timber. For his purposes, however, it was perfect. He spent 2 full days carefully harvesting the bark. He did not girdle the trees, which would have killed them. Instead, he made long vertical cuts and peeled away wide sheets, taking only what he needed from each tree, a sustainable practice taught by his grandfather. The bark, when fresh, was remarkably pliable and possessed natural oils that made it almost completely impervious to water. Back at his cabin, he began the painstaking process of laying the bark. Starting at the lowest edge of the roof, he laid the sheets horizontally, overlapping each by at least a foot, creating a layered defense against moisture, much like the scales of a fish. Every seam he meticulously sealed with hot pine pitch, which he rendered himself from pine knots collected in the forest. The process filled the air with a sharp, clean scent that stood in stark contrast to the town's judgment. Mayor Thompson rode by on his horse one afternoon, pausing to look at the strange pale patchwork covering the roof. "Preparing for a flood, Thorn?" he called out, a smirk on his face. "That flimsy bark will be pulp by midwinter." Elias simply nodded and continued his work, pressing another heated strip of bark into a seam, the black pitch oozing out to create a perfect, waterproof seal. The materials for this stage were free, costing him only his labor. By October 15th, the membrane was complete. The cabin roof was now a seamless, slightly sticky expanse of off-white and black. The next layer was the sod, which would provide the bulk of the insulation. For this, Elias needed a specific type of earth. He traveled a mile up to a high, windswept meadow where the grasses grew thick and their roots matted together into a dense, fibrous web. This was key. The interlocking root system was what would prevent the sod from eroding or turning to mud. Using a sharpened spade and a cutting tool his grandfather had designed, he began to slice the meadow into uniform bricks. Each brick measured precisely 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, and was a full 6 inches thick. Each one weighed nearly 40 pounds. Transporting the sod was the most physically demanding part of the entire endeavor. He had no horse or cart, only a simple wooden sledge he had built. For a week, from sunup to sundown, he made the 2-mile round trip, hauling 3 or 4 sod bricks at a time. The men from the lumber mill would pass him on the trail, their wagons laden with modern, milled planks, and they would shake their heads in amusement. "Working hard, Thorn?" one called. "Or hardly working?" The joke was uninspired, but it drew laughter from his companions. Elias did not respond. He simply leaned into the harness of his sledge, the muscles in his back and legs burning, and focused on the rhythm of his own breathing and the steady progress he was making. He calculated he would need approximately 320 sod bricks to cover the 320 square feet of his roof. By October 22nd, he had a formidable stack of dark, earthy rectangles piled beside his cabin. The laying of the sod required the same methodical precision as the bark. He started at the eaves and worked his way up to the peak, laying the bricks in a tight herringbone pattern. This arrangement ensured that the seams were not aligned, which would both improve insulation and prevent water from finding a direct channel downwards. He laid the first layer with the grass side down, allowing the dense root mat to knit into the bark below. He then laid a second 6-inch layer with the grass side up. The result was a full foot of dense, root-woven earth covering his entire roof. He was, in effect, transplanting a living piece of the high meadow onto his home. The final sod brick was laid on October 26th. The cost of this stage was measured not in dollars, but in sweat and sheer endurance. The cabin already felt different. Inside, the world became muffled and quiet. The sharp sounds of the wind were softened to a low whisper. The temperature within the small space was noticeably more stable, holding the heat from his small stove for hours after the fire had died down to embers. This was the principle of thermal mass in action, a concept his grandfather had understood intimately. The immense weight of the earth absorbed and stored thermal energy, releasing it slowly. It was a living, breathing part of the house, a stark contrast to the thin, thermally inefficient shingle roofs of the town. The final layer was the stone. This was the element that drew the most overt scorn from his neighbors. To them, piling rocks on a roof was the act of a madman. To Elias, it was the final, critical component of a complex system. The stones would serve three purposes. They would compress the sod, enhancing its insulating properties. They would protect the sod from the scouring force of the wind, and their sheer, unyielding weight would be the ultimate anchor, making the roof an immovable object. He spent the last days of October and the first week of November hauling stones from the wide, shallow river that ran through the valley. He was not looking for just any rocks. He needed flat, dense slate and granite, stones that would lie flush against each other and distribute their weight evenly. He selected each one by hand, testing its shape and heft, loading them onto his sledge for the slow journey back to his cabin. He hauled over 5 tons of stone, piece by piece. Silas Miller, riding past on his way back from a hunting trip, pulled his horse to a stop. "Thorne, for the love of God, what are you doing? That roof can't possibly hold that weight. You're a stubborn fool, but I've no wish to be digging your body out of the wreckage come spring." "The weight is the point, Mr. Miller," Elias said, his voice strained from exertion as he heaved another 100-pound slab of granite onto the pile. "It is not a burden. It is an anchor." Miller just shook his head and rode on, convinced he had just spoken to a man with a death wish. Thorne's Folly, the name Carlson had coined, was now the official, albeit unspoken, name for Elias's home throughout Prospect. It was a landmark of eccentricity, a cautionary tale in the making. Starting on November 8th, he began placing the stones. It was like assembling a massive horizontal puzzle. He used a simple ramp and pulley system to hoist the larger slabs onto the roof. He fit them together with painstaking care, leaving only the barest of gaps between them. The final stone, a triangular piece of dark gray slate, was wedged into place at the roof's peak on the afternoon of November 12, 1876. The work was done. He stood back and looked at his creation. It was unlike any other structure in the valley. It did not look like a house in the conventional sense. It looked like a part of the landscape, a small, grassy hillock from which a chimney pipe protruded, its stone-covered roofline blending into the gray scree of the mountain behind it. Grasses and wildflowers, dormant for the winter, were already visible in the sod. Come spring, it would bloom. The total weight of the roof, timber, bark, sod, and stone, was an estimated 9 tons. The total cash expenditure for materials had been $27 in silver coins, a sum he had earned through trapping and selling pelts. The rest had been paid for with knowledge, foresight, and relentless labor. As the first snowflakes of the season began to drift down from a leaden sky, Elias went inside his quiet, solid home, stoked the fire, and waited. The first few weeks of winter were deceptively mild, a fact that only amplified the town's mockery of Elias's Herculean efforts. The new shingle roofs on the other cabins, paid for with coin and credit from Mayor Thompson's mill, looked sharp and uniform under the light dustings of snow. They shed the powder easily, presenting a clean, dark contrast to the white landscape. Elias's roof, on the other hand, held the snow. It accumulated in a thick, pristine blanket, further blurring the line between his home and the surrounding environment. "See there?" Jedediah Carlson announced one afternoon at the general store, pointing out the window towards Elias's distant cabin. "The fool didn't even give his roof enough pitch to shed the snow. It's just piling up. Imagine the weight when we get a real storm. The whole thing will come down like a house of cards." The men around the stove nodded in agreement, their confidence buoyed by the consensus of the group. Not one of them had lost a family member to the brutal winters of the high country. Not one had burned through their entire wood supply by February, their poorly insulated homes leaking precious heat into the indifferent air. And not one of them would admit, even to themselves, that the quiet warmth and stability of Elias Thorne's cabin might represent a wisdom they had arrogantly discarded. Elias, for his part, was living in a state of unprecedented comfort. The foot of sod and the layer of stone, now covered by another foot of insulating snow, created a thermal barrier of remarkable efficiency. His small wood stove, which in previous years had to be fed constantly, now required only a few logs in the morning and a few in the evening to maintain a comfortable temperature. The silence was the most profound change. The howling winds that raked the valley were reduced to a distant, almost pleasant murmur. He could sit and read one of his few books by the light of a single oil lamp, the world outside held at bay by a shield of his own making. He was burning less than a third of the firewood he had used the previous winter, a conservation of resources that the other townsfolk, in their drafty shingle-roofed cabins, could not have imagined. An old trapper named Silas, a man who lived outside the town and its politics, stopped by Elias's cabin in early December. He was one of the few who had not mocked the project, watching its progress with a quiet, knowing curiosity. He ran a hand over the cold stones at the edge of the roof where they met the log walls. "The earth holds the heat, and the stone holds the earth," he said, his voice raspy from years of solitude. "The old ways." "My grandfather's ways," Elias corrected gently. The trapper squinted at the sky, which was a strange, milky yellow. He sniffed the air. "The elk have moved low. The wolves are quiet. The sky has a sick look to it. A big storm is coming, son. A white hurricane. I've seen it twice in my life. This will be the third." He looked from the sky to the roof, and for the first time a small smile touched his weathered face. "You might be the only man in Prospect with sense enough to see it coming." He accepted a cup of hot water from Elias, nodded his thanks, and continued on his way, a grim harbinger whose warning would go unheeded by the town's confident leadership. The trapper's premonition proved terrifyingly accurate. The storm began on the night of December 18th, 1876. It did not arrive with the bluster of a normal blizzard. It descended. A heavy, unnaturally thick snowfall began in the dead calm of twilight, the flakes so large and dense they seemed to absorb all sound. By midnight, over 2 feet of snow had already accumulated. Then the wind came. It was not a gale. It was a physical assault, a solid wall of moving air that hit the valley with a low, guttural roar. The residents of Prospect, secure in their newly repaired homes, awoke to the sound of a world being torn apart. Inside his cabin, Elias was awakened not by the sound but by the pressure. A deep, resonant vibration hummed through the very logs of his home. The wind outside was not howling. It was a sustained, deafening shriek, a sound he had never before heard. Yet inside, the noise was muted. The fury of the storm translated into a low thrum that spoke of immense forces being safely displaced and absorbed. The thick, heavy roof did not shudder or groan. It was an immovable part of the mountain, and the storm treated it as such, flowing over it like water over a boulder. He lit a lamp and checked the new support beams. They were solid, unmoving. The only sign of the tempest outside was the fine powder of snow being forced through minuscule cracks in the doorframe. He was safe. He was warm. He was the sole occupant of an island of calm in a sea of meteorological violence. In the town, chaos reigned. The first roof to fail was Jedediah Carlson's, whose house was the largest and, he had boasted, the best constructed. The wind, which the meteorologists of a later era would have classified as gusting well over 100 miles per hour, found the edge of his new shingles. It peeled back a section, and once the seal was broken, the storm savaged the structure. With a sound like a cannon shot, a third of the roof was ripped away and sent cartwheeling into the white darkness. Snow and wind blasted into the upper floor of his home, where his family was sleeping. Panic was followed by a cascade of failures. The sheer weight of the snow, which was falling at a rate of 4 inches an hour, was immense. But it was the wind that was the true destroyer. It turned the heavy, wet snow into a battering ram, piling it into colossal drifts against the windward side of buildings. The weight became asymmetrical, placing stresses on the wooden frames they were never designed to withstand. The groaning of stressed timbers became a common sound, punctuated by the sharp crack of a breaking rafter or the terrifying crash of a collapsing roof. The blacksmith shop, with its wide, unsupported roof span, was one of the first to go completely, its roof caving in with a great sigh of splintering wood and twisted metal. Mayor Thompson's house, a proud two-story structure built with lumber from his own mill, suffered a mortal blow around 3 in the morning. A massive gust tore the chimney from its moorings. The flying bricks smashed a hole in the roof, and the wind, now inside the attic, began to lift the structure from within. With a final, agonized groan, the entire roof lifted, tilted, and collapsed inward, bringing tons of snow down into the living quarters. The Thompson family scrambled out into the blizzard, their home destroyed behind them. The storm raged without pause for 2 full days and nights. The world was reduced to a roaring, blinding whiteness. Visibility was less than 5 feet. The temperature plummeted to 20 degrees below zero, and the wind chill was a lethal force that could freeze exposed flesh in under a minute. For the people of Prospect, it was an apocalypse. They abandoned their ruined homes, struggling through waist-deep snow and disorienting winds to find shelter. The meeting hall, centrally located and slightly more protected by a stand of old-growth pines, became the town's de facto storm shelter. But it too was failing. Its roof sagged dangerously under a mountain of snow, and the wind had shattered most of its windows, allowing the bitter cold to pour in. They huddled together in the dark, their numbers diminished, their pride shattered, listening to the storm dismantle their world. Throughout this ordeal, Elias Thorne remained in his quiet sanctuary. He had food, water, and an ample supply of firewood. He passed the time by oiling his tools and reading. The sheer normality of his existence was a stark contrast to the life-or-death struggle unfolding less than a quarter of a mile away. He knew the storm was catastrophic, but he could not know the full extent of the devastation. On the morning of the 3rd day, December 21st, the wind began to subside. Its shriek lowered to a manageable howl, and the snowfall lessened. The world outside his window was an unrecognizable landscape of monumental snowdrifts, some reaching as high as the roofline of his own cabin. He knew he could not wait any longer. The people in the town would need help. He prepared carefully, dressing in layers of wool and oilskin. He packed a small bag with dried meat, a flask of hot water, and a length of rope. Shoveling his way out of the cabin was an immense task. A drift 10 feet high was packed against his door. It took him nearly an hour of exhausting work to carve a narrow tunnel to the outside world. When he finally emerged, the sight that greeted him was one of utter desolation. The town of Prospect was gone, buried beneath a sea of white. Only a few shattered remnants of buildings poked through the snow like the broken ribs of a carcass. The air was filled with an eerie silence, broken only by the mournful whistle of the wind. He began the arduous trek towards the town center, his snowshoes sinking deep into the powdery snow with every step. The landscape was so transformed that he had to navigate by the tops of the tallest pine trees. He saw the skeletal remains of Carlson's house first, its upper story sheared away. He saw the flattened ruin of the blacksmith's shop. He saw house after house either collapsed or buried so completely that they were nothing more than suspicious mounds in the snow. A profound and somber weight settled upon him. This was a tragedy on a scale he had not imagined. He finally reached the meeting hall. Its roof was sagging so severely it looked like a sway-backed horse, and the great pines that had protected it were stripped bare on their windward side. He saw a faint, flickering light through one of the boarded-up windows and heard a low sound, the collective moan of human misery. He cleared the snow from the door and forced it open. The scene inside was grim. Around 40 survivors were huddled together, wrapped in every blanket and scrap of cloth they could find. They were shivering, their faces blue with cold, their eyes wide with shock and despair. A small, smoky fire of broken furniture provided the only light and a pathetic amount of heat. Among the crowd, he saw them all. Mayor Thompson, his face a mask of disbelief. Silas Miller, his powerful arms wrapped around his shivering children. And Jedediah Carlson, who sat staring blankly at the wall, his wealth and status rendered meaningless. Their gazes lifted as Elias entered, a figure of impossible health and strength silhouetted against the white glare from the open door. For a long moment, no one spoke. It was Mayor Thompson who finally broke the silence, his voice a hoarse, broken whisper. "Thorn, you're home?" Elias's reply was simple, devoid of triumph or accusation. It was a statement of fact, delivered in the same calm, measured tone he had used in this very hall months before. "My home is standing. It is warm. There is food." A wave of sheer, unadulterated hope, the first they had felt in days, washed over the survivors. To be warm again, to be safe. It was a concept so foreign and so desperately needed that it brought tears to their eyes. Elias did not wait for a debate. He took charge with a quiet authority that no one dared to question. "The journey will be difficult," he announced. "We will use my rope to stay together. The children and the infirm will be in the middle. We move now, before the wind returns." He led the miserable procession out into the ruined world. The trek to his cabin was a brutal ordeal. The wind was still strong enough to steal the breath, and the deep snow was exhausting. But the image of a warm, safe shelter, of Thorn's Folly, pulled them forward. When they finally arrived, they stopped, staring in collective disbelief. There it was, exactly as they had last seen it, a small snow-covered hillock, solid and utterly unfazed by the storm that had obliterated their lives. A thin plume of smoke rose calmly from the chimney, a beacon of impossible normalcy. Elias cleared the entrance once more and ushered them inside. The contrast was so profound it was physically shocking. They stepped from a world of howling wind and lethal cold into a space of deep, encompassing warmth and profound silence. The air was dry and smelled of wood smoke and hot tea. The small stove radiated a steady, comforting heat that seemed to seep into their very bones. They looked up at the massive, hand-hewn beams Elias had installed, and for the first time, they understood. They saw not the crude construction of a fool, but the powerful, intelligent design of a master builder. The weight that they had mocked was the very thing that had saved them. The 40 survivors packed into the small cabin, a space no more than 320 square feet, but it felt like a cathedral of safety. Elias prepared hot broth and tea, distributing his meager supplies with quiet efficiency. The skeptics, the men who had been his most vocal critics, were the most deeply affected. Silas Miller, the blacksmith, sat on the floor, his head in his hands, weeping silently. Jedediah Carlson, the landowner, simply stared at the thick log walls, his expression one of utter, soul-shattering humility. After everyone had eaten and the initial shock had begun to wear off, Mayor Thaddeus Thompson approached Elias. The mayor, who had once stood so tall and confident, now seemed diminished, his face etched with grief and a dawning, terrible understanding. "Thorn," he began, his voice thick with emotion. I was wrong. We were arrogant fools. We trusted in our new ways, in our saws and our nails, and we scorned your wisdom. We called this place Thorn's Folly." He gestured around the warm, secure room. "It seems the folly was ours. You built the only true house in this entire valley." Elias simply nodded, accepting the apology without malice or triumph. His victory was not in their admission of error, but in the simple fact that they were alive to make it. "It is not my wisdom, Mayor," he said, his voice low. "It is the wisdom of the mountain. My grandfather taught me that you do not defeat a force like that storm. You yield to it. You make yourself so strong and so heavy that the wind and the snow see you as just another stone. The roof is not on the house. It is a piece of the earth, placed upon the house to shield it." The storm finally broke on Christmas Eve. The sun emerged, casting a brilliant, painful light over the transformed valley. The town of Prospect had ceased to exist. It was a field of white mounds, a graveyard of homes and misplaced confidence. The final toll was grim. 14 people had not survived the storm, lost in the initial collapses or succumbing to the cold. The survivors, safe within the walls of Thorn's Folly, looked out upon the devastation with a somber reverence. They understood now the price of their pride. In the spring of 1877, they began to rebuild. But they did not rebuild as before. The lumber mill was gone, the blacksmith shop a ruin. They rebuilt with what they had, stone and earth, and the knowledge that Elias Thorn now shared freely. He taught them how to lay a foundation of stone, how to brace their walls with massive timbers, how to harvest birch bark without killing the trees. He showed them where to find the best sod and how to lay it in a locking pattern. Thorn's Folly became the model, the template for the new town of Prospect. The new homes that rose from the ruins were different. They were lower to the ground, more solid, with thick living roofs that held the snow in the winter and bloomed with wildflowers in the summer. They were no longer temporary assertions of human will against the wilderness, but permanent, humble integrations with it. Elias Thorne, the outcast, the fool, became their teacher, their leader, the quiet sage whose ancestral wisdom had saved them from their own modern ignorance. His vindication was complete, not in the shouted apologies of humbled men, but in the quiet, solid reality of the homes that rose around him, each one a silent, enduring testament to the man they had mocked, and the simple, profound truth of his rock roof.